September 15, 1916. Flers-Courcelette, France. The German soldiers of the 3rd Bavarian Division, entrenched in their positions, witnessed an apparition. Through the pre-dawn mist and the smoke of a rolling artillery barrage, the ground itself seemed to be moving.
Gigantic, rhomboidal shapes of steel, crushing barbed wire and crossing trenches, advanced upon them. The sound was a deafening clatter of tracks and a roar of an engine unlike anything ever heard on a battlefield. Machine gun bullets, the weapon that had ruled the front for 2 years, simply sparked and ricocheted off their gray hides.
German after-action reports from that morning would be filled with confusion, disbelief, and a new primal terror. They had just met a weapon that would end their world. They were not tanks. The men who built them, in a desperate attempt to maintain secrecy, had codenamed them water carriers from Mesopotamia. But on this day, the world would come to know them as the Mark I. It was a machine born of desperation, a crude, flawed, and mechanically catastrophic invention that was, nonetheless, about to change warfare forever.
The story of the tank begins not with an invention, but with a problem, the stalemate of the Western Front. By late 1914, the war in Europe had ground to a halt. The defensive power of the machine gun and the trench had become absolute. A single, well-placed Vickers or Maxim gun could annihilate an entire battalion of infantry in minutes.
Offensive doctrine was bankrupt. Generals on both sides, trained in 19th-century tactics of maneuver and cavalry, reverted to suicidal, Napoleonic-style mass infantry assaults. The result was a static line of trenches, mud, and barbed wire stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a 400-mile meat grinder that was consuming an entire generation.
The solution, though not yet recognized, was clear. A weapon was needed that combined 3 elements: firepower, protection, and, most critically, mobility over the shell-cratered, wire-strewn expanse of no man's land.
The Battle of Loos in 1915 was a perfect, horrifying example. The British released 140 tons of chlorine gas, only to have the wind blow it back into their own lines, before sending 75,000 men over the top. The attack gained almost no ground and cost nearly 60,000 casualties. This was the problem the generals could not solve. The concept of an armored fighting vehicle was not new. H.G. Wells had imagined land ironclads in a 1903 short story. But in 1914, a few forward-thinking officers began to see it as a military necessity. The primary advocate was Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton. In October 1914, he proposed the creation of a machine gun destroyer, a tracked vehicle based on the American-made Holt agricultural tractor. His proposal was dismissed by the General Staff as impractical. But Swinton found a crucial ally, Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill, frustrated by the Army's conservatism, saw the potential. In February 1915, he established the Admiralty Landships Committee, using naval funds to secretly develop a new weapon for the Army. The committee's brief was simple: create a vehicle that could cross a 5-foot trench, climb a 4.5-foot parapet, and be immune to machine gun fire. The engineers tasked with this were William Tritton, director of the agricultural firm William Foster & Company, and Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, a naval engineer.
Their first attempt, built in the summer of 1915, was No. 1 Lincoln machine, or Little Willie. It was by all accounts a failure. It used a 105 horsepower Daimler engine and possessed armored plates, but its tracks, bought from an American tractor company, were too short. It was slow, and it could not cross the wide trenches it was designed to defeat.
But it was a proof of concept. Wilson and Tritton immediately began work on a radical new design. To solve the trench crossing problem, Wilson designed a track frame that ran around the entire circumference of the vehicle, creating the iconic rhomboidal or lozenge shape. This new machine, His Majesty's Landship Centipede, or Mother, was the true prototype. To maintain secrecy during production, the machines were given a cover story. The workers at the factory were told they were building mobile water carriers for the Mesopotamia campaign. The massive empty hulls were even stenciled with the words, "With care to Petrograd." Because of this code name, the new weapon acquired its permanent name, the tank.
The production model, the Mark I, was a mechanical monster. It was 32.5 feet long, including its tail steering wheels, a feature later found to be useless, and weighed 28 tons. The tank came in two variants, male and female. The male tank, designed to destroy machine gun nests and artillery, was armed with two naval 6-pounder, 57mm guns, mounted inside turrets called sponsons, and 4 Hotchkiss machine guns. The female tank was an infantry support version, armed exclusively with 6 Vickers or Hotchkiss machine guns. Its armor was thin, ranging from 6mm to 12mm. This was just enough to stop contemporary rifle and machine gun bullets, but it was completely vulnerable to artillery and the new German armor-piercing K bullet. It was propelled by a 105 horsepower Daimler Knight engine, giving it a theoretical top speed of 3.7 miles per hour, a slow walking pace. Its real-world speed over cratered ground was often less than 1 mile per hour.
The Mark I's greatest flaw was its crew conditions. It required an 8-man crew, a commander, a driver, 2 gearsmen, and 4 gunners. The interior was a vision of hell. The engine was in the center of the crew compartment, unshielded. The heat inside quickly rose to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius. The noise was so deafening that the crew could not hear each other's shouts. Most critically, the Mark I possessed no radio.
Internal communication was done by shouting or hand signals. External communication was primitive, flags, colored discs, signal lamps, or carrier pigeons, all of which were useless in the smoke and chaos of battle. Steering the machine was a 4-man operation. The driver controlled the throttle and clutch. The commander operated the brakes, and the 2 gearsmen, one on each side of the engine, had to be signaled by the driver to engage their respective track's primary and secondary gears. A simple left turn required the driver to signal one gearsman to put his track in neutral, while the other gearsman kept his in gear. It was a physically exhausting and complex system.
Worse, when hit by machine gun fire, the armor did not stop the bullets so much as catch them. The kinetic energy would shear off hot, microscopic slivers of steel from the inside of the plate, a phenomenon known as spalling. This spall would fly around the compartment like shrapnel, blinding and wounding the crew. Crews were issued leather and chainmail masks to protect their faces.
The tank's debut was part of the failing Somme offensive. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig was desperate for a breakthrough. Against the advice of Colonel Swinton, who insisted the tanks be used in a massive, overwhelming surprise assault,
Haig ordered the 49 available Mark I's to be committed to battle in small packets in support of infantry. The plan was a disaster. The machines were plagued by mechanical failures.
Of the 49 tanks delivered, only 32 were mechanically fit to start the attack. Of those 32, 9 tanks broke down from engine failure or ditching before reaching the German lines. 5 tanks became ditched or stuck in the chaotic, muddy terrain. 9 tanks were knocked out by German artillery fire. Only 9 Mark I tanks actually made it across the German front line to achieve their objectives.
But what those 9 tanks achieved was revolutionary. One tank, D-17, advanced alone and captured a heavily defended German trench system. Another drove down the main street of the village of Flers, followed by cheering British infantry, achieving a breakthrough that had cost tens of thousands of lives just weeks before. The psychological impact was far greater than the tactical one. German after-action reports were frantic. Soldiers reported being paralyzed and terrified by these armored monsters that were immune to their machine guns. Entire units broke and fled at their approach. The phenomenon was dubbed Panzer Shrek, or tank fright. The British, despite the mechanical failures, had just discovered the key to breaking the trench. German High Command was slow to react. They dismissed the new weapon as a gimmick and a toy. They believed its mechanical unreliability and vulnerability to artillery meant it would never be a decisive weapon.
Their initial solution was not to build their own tanks, but to develop countermeasures. The 7.92mm K-bullet, or Spitzgeschoss M mit Kern, was issued to machine gunners, which could penetrate the Mark I's thin side armor at close range. Field artillery was ordered to prioritize these machines.
By the time Germany recognized the tank's potential, it was 1917, and they were hopelessly behind. Their only major tank of the war, the A7V, was a tactical and industrial failure. It was a massive, boxy 34-ton vehicle with a crew of 18 men. It was top-heavy, mechanically unreliable, and its low-slung chassis made it incapable of crossing the very trenches it was meant to fight in. While the Allies would build over 8,000 tanks during the war, Germany produced only 20 A7Vs.
German High Command, while dismissive, was not entirely idle. As the K-bullet proved insufficient against the improved armor of the British Mark IV, German engineers raced to field a dedicated anti-tank weapon. The result was the Tankgewehr 18, or T-Gewehr. This was, in essence, a comically oversized 13.2mm single-shot rifle. It was a 41-pound behemoth that required a 2-man team to operate. While crude, it was the world's first dedicated anti-tank rifle, and it was brutally effective. Its hardened steel core bullet could penetrate the 12mm to 14mm armor of a Mark IV tank at 100 meters. This weapon highlighted the new terrifying reality of armored warfare. German machine gun crews, once safe in their bunkers, were now issued T-Gewehr and trained to target the sponson ports and vision slits of the advancing Landships.
The second, more desperate countermeasure was the Geberball, or Geballte Ladung. This was a bundle charge, 6 standard-issue steel hand granata stick grenade heads, wrapped and wired around a single complete grenade in the center. This 1.7-kilogram improvised explosive was to be thrown onto the tank's tracks or engine deck.
It was, in effect, a suicide mission for the infantrymen, who had to get within throwing distance of a machine gun-armed vehicle, but it was one of the few ways to disable the new weapon.
While the British were developing their landships, the French were working on their own parallel solutions. The first French tank to see action was the Schneider CA-1, which debuted in April 1917. It was a failure. Based on the same Holt tractor chassis as Little Willie, it featured a short 75mm howitzer in the right front. Its long, overhanging nose was designed to crush barbed wire, but instead caused it to get hopelessly ditched in trenches and shell craters.
Hot on its heels was the St. Chamond. This tank was a product of industrial rivalry, not tactical sense. It was heavier and longer than the Schneider, and its tracks were far too short for its body. It too was a mechanical disaster, frequently getting stuck. Both of these French tanks suffered from the same flaw as the British Mark I. They were seen as assault guns, mobile artillery to support infantry. They were not seen as a new class of weapon.
The true vindication of the tank came not at the Somme, but at the Battle of Cambrai. This time, the lessons had been learned. Instead of deploying tanks in small, scattered groups, the British amassed 476 Mark IV tanks, an improved Mark I. They launched a surprise massed assault on a narrow front, without the usual days-long preliminary artillery barrage that had always sacrificed surprise.
The effect was catastrophic. The tanks, advancing with the infantry, shattered the Hindenburg Line, one of the most formidable defensive systems on the Western Front. In 6 hours, they achieved a breakthrough of 5 miles, an advance that had been unthinkable for 3 years. Critically, the Mark IV tanks at Cambrai featured improved communication. While still lacking radios, they used signal flags and signal lamps that were more standardized, allowing platoon leaders to coordinate. However, when the command tanks were knocked out or broke down, coordination still collapsed, proving that a true command and control system was still missing.
The Mark I was a prototype forced into combat. Its failures directly led to a rapid wartime evolution. Mark II and III, training. Built in small numbers, these were used to test new concepts like improved armor. Mark IV, the workhorse, the most produced British heavy tank. It featured improved armor up to 14 millimeters to defeat the Cavalry, a better 6-pounder gun, and a relocated fuel tank for crew safety. This was the tank used at Cambrai.
Mark V, the drivable tank. This was the tank the Mark I should have been. A new 150-horsepower Ricardo engine and Wilson's new epicyclic steering system finally allowed one man, the driver, to steer the tank. The commander could now command rather than assisting with braking. The Whippet, the cavalry, while the heavy marks were for breaking the line, the 14-ton Whippet was a fast tank, 8 miles per hour, designed to exploit the gap just as cavalry had once done.
This rapid evolution set the stage for a new, inevitable milestone. On April 24, 1918, near the village of Villers-Bretonneux, the first tank versus tank battle in history took place. The encounter was a confused, clumsy, and terrifying glimpse into the future. 3 British Mark IVs, 2 females, armed only with machine guns, and 1 male, armed with 6-pounder Tannins, were advancing in support of infantry.
Suddenly, they were engaged by a German A7V tank, the Nix. The 2 British female tanks were hopelessly outgunned. Their machine gun bullets sparked uselessly off the A7V's armor. Both were damaged by the German tank's 57mm cannon fire and forced to withdraw, their crews bailing out.
This left only the British male tank, commanded by Lieutenant Frank Mitchell. What followed was a slow, lumbering duel.
The two tanks fired at each other while moving, a nearly impossible feat of gunnery at the time. Mitchell's Mark IV was hit, but his 6-pounder guns found their mark. He fired 3 shots, striking the A7V. The German tank heeled over on its side and was abandoned by its crew.
Moments later, Mitchell's tank was engaged by 2 more German A7Vs, supported by infantry. His tank was crippled. This brief, chaotic battle, the first of its kind, proved 2 things. The female tank was now obsolete, and the age of tank-on-tank warfare had officially begun.
This German innovation, however, was born from a British victory. The true culmination of Allied tank doctrine in World War I was the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918. This battle, which German General Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army, was the ultimate vindication of the Landship concept.
This was not a clumsy experiment like the Somme. This was a symphony of combined arms. Over 530 Allied tanks, mostly British Mark Vs and Whippets, advanced alongside Australian and Canadian infantry, supported by 800 aircraft and 2,000 artillery guns.
The Mark V, with its new one-man steering system, was now a truly functional combat vehicle. The coordination was unprecedented. The tank smashed the German lines, creating a 15-mile wide gap. The psychological shock from which the German army would never recover was not just from the defeat, but from the realization that the Allies had finally perfected this new form of warfare. The success at Amiens led directly to J.F.C. Fuller's Plan 1919. This was a theoretical plan for a massive, war-winning offensive in 1919. It was nothing short of a blueprint for Blitzkrieg, 20 years early. The plan called for thousands of new medium-D tanks, which were faster and had a 360-degree turret to smash through the German lines, ignore the infantry, and race deep into the enemy's rear. Their sole targets would be headquarters, supply dumps, and communication lines, while heavy bombers would simultaneously attack the same targets.
The plan was never executed. The armistice was signed in November 1918, but Plan 1919 became the foundational text for every interwar armor theorist, including Heinz Guderian. The legacy of the crude, clattering Mark I was not just the end of trench warfare. It was the blueprint for the next 70 years of mobile, mechanized combat.
While the British had invented the heavy breakthrough tank, it was the French who invented the modern tank. In 1917, the Renault FT-17 was introduced. It was a small 2-man light tank that established the blueprint for every single tank built since. Engine in the back, driver in the front, and a fully rotating turret on top. This was the design that would be copied by all nations. The Germans in the 1930s would study the FT-17 and the British breakthrough at Cambrai. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, would combine the idea of the British massed assault with the design of the French FT-17 and, as the WW2 Tales video so brilliantly proved, add the crucial, missing piece, a radio in every single tank. In Germany, a young officer named Heinz Guderian read their work. He studied the British Mark I, the French FT-17, and the British theories. He would combine all three into the British concept, massed tank formations from Cambrai, the French design, the rotating turret from the FT-17, the German innovation, a radio in every single tank. This combination, of course, would become known as Blitzkrieg. The war ended, but the debate over the tank had just begun. In Britain,
Military theorists J.F.C. Fuller and B.H.L. Liddell Hart studied the lessons of Cambrai. They argued that tanks should not be infantry support weapons. They should be their own force, a mechanized cavalry that would strike deep into the enemy's rear, targeting supply lines and headquarters and avoiding a new trench stalemate.
The Mark I tank was, by every objective measure, a terrible machine. It was slow, agonizingly hot, mechanically primitive, and a death trap for its 8-man crew. Of the 150 built, few survived the war, most being lost to breakdowns rather than enemy fire.
But the Mark I's value was not in its armor or its gun. It was in its idea. It was the first weapon to mechanically solve the problem of the trench, the machine gun, and the barbed wire. It broke the psychological and tactical stalemate that had defined the Great War.
The crude, clattering water carrier that emerged from the mist on September 15, 1916, was the direct ancestor of the M4 Sherman, the Soviet T-34, and the modern M1 Abrams. It was a 28-ton symbol of a new age, proving that in modern warfare, the stalemate would not be broken by flesh, but by steel and by the relentless, brutal engine of industrial innovation.